The sun had barely risen when a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out of a sleek black SUV, parked discreetly on the edge of Greenville, Mississippi. This was no ordinary morning for James Curtis. As the first black man in decades to hold the title of FBI director, every move he made carried weight. This wasn't just about leadership. It was about breaking barriers and dismantling the unspoken systems that thrived in places like Greenville. The small southern city had become notorious for its unchecked police misconduct, a reputation James couldn't ignore. Instead of sending a team, he had chosen to go himself, undercover, to get a raw, unfiltered look at the situation. His attire, a plain gray hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, was carefully selected to ensure he blended in. No suit, no badge, no entourage. Just a man walking the streets of a neighborhood that seemed to wear its tension like a second skin. The morning air was damp, carrying the earthy scent of freshly cut grass. The streets were quiet, save for the faint rustle of trees and distant bird calls. But James wasn't fooled by the peaceful facade. Greenville had secrets, and he was here to unearth them. A few miles away, the end of a night shift brought 3 cops together in their patrol car. Nick Holloway, the self-appointed leader of the trio, leaned back in the driver's seat, his hand resting casually on the wheel. His reputation for dark humor and unchecked arrogance had earned him notoriety among his peers. Beside him sat Jerry Wicks, a lanky man with a permanent smirk, and Todd Carpenter, who had perfected the art of following orders without question. Together, they were a toxic cocktail of authority and abuse, emboldened by a culture that rarely held them accountable. The night had been quiet, too quiet. As they cruised through the streets, boredom hung heavy in the air. Nick's eyes narrowed as they passed a man walking alone, his casual appearance immediately catching their attention. "Look at this guy," Nick muttered, nodding toward James. "What the hell is he doing out here this early?" Jerry chuckled. "Bet he's lost, or stupid enough to think he belongs here." The patrol car slowed, tires crunching against the pavement as it came to a stop alongside James. Nick rolled down the window, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning, buddy. What are you doing out here?" James glanced at them, his expression calm, measured. "Just out for a walk." The simplicity of the response didn't sit well with Nick. He stepped out of the car, his boots hitting the pavement with an authoritative thud. "You don't look like you belong here," Nick said, closing the distance. James stood his ground, his eyes unwavering. "I'm not breaking any laws." The calm defiance in James's voice stoked the simmering irritation in Nick. Jerry and Todd flanked their leader, forming a loose triangle around James. "This is our turf," Todd added, his voice dripping with condescension. "People like you don't just stroll through here without a damn good reason." James didn't flinch. His years in law enforcement had taught him that men like these thrived on fear and submission, neither of which he intended to give, but his silence only fueled their frustration. "Enough talking," Nick growled, reaching for his handcuffs. "Let's show this guy what happens when you don't respect authority." Before James could react, he felt the cold steel of the cuffs snap around his wrists. They dragged him to a nearby lamppost, their movements brusque and deliberate. Jerry disappeared momentarily, returning with a rope from the trunk of the patrol car. "This'll be good," Nick said, grinning as they tied James to the post. The rough fibers of the rope bit into his skin, but James didn't show any sign of discomfort. The trio stepped back to admire their work, laughing as they began snapping photos and recording videos. "Smile for the camera, tough guy," Jerry sneered. "You think you're so smart, huh?" Nick added. "Bet you'll think twice before walking through here again." James remained silent, his expression unreadable. But behind his composed exterior, his mind was working overtime. He cataloged every detail: the patrol car's number, the officers' badges, their smug expressions. This wasn't just humiliation, it was evidence. For the 3 officers, this was just another joke, a harmless bit of fun at the expense of someone they didn't see as an equal. They didn't realize that the man they'd tied to a pole wasn't just another nameless victim. He was the newly appointed director of the FBI, and every second of their cruel prank was being etched into his memory. After a few minutes of mockery, the officers decided their work was done. They left James tied to the post, laughing as they drove off, already sharing the videos among themselves. As the sound of their car faded, James took a deep breath. He wasn't angry. He was focused. The humiliation they had intended to inflict was nothing compared to what he planned to unleash in return. The streets of Greenville seemed to awaken slowly as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon. James remained tied to the pole, his mind racing but his body still. Every muscle in his frame was poised, every breath controlled. He wasn't just waiting for someone to come along, he was assessing the layers of the situation. As a man of power and influence, James had spent years navigating environments where his presence was met with quiet resistance or outright hostility. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, but it was the most visceral encounter he'd had in years. The irony of being tied to a lamppost, treated like an object of ridicule, was not lost on him. The town itself seemed complicit in its silence. Cars passed intermittently, their drivers either unaware of James's predicament or unwilling to intervene. Greenville had long been a place where the wrong kind of attention could cost more than it was worth. From his vantage point, James observed a small grocery store across the street. The elderly shopkeeper glanced at him once but quickly turned away, pretending to organize items in the display window. A young boy on a bicycle hesitated as he passed, his wide eyes filled with curiosity and fear. James offered him a faint smile, a gesture that seemed to startle the child, who pedaled away quickly. James's thoughts shifted to the three officers. Men like Nick, Jerry, and Todd weren't anomalies. They were products of a system designed to protect them. He had read their personnel files the night before. Nick had a history of complaints from both colleagues and civilians, but none had stuck. Jerry's disciplinary record was spotless, likely because he stayed in Nick's shadow, a loyal follower who never questioned orders. Todd was the least experienced of the three, a rookie who had already learned that survival in Greenville's police force required loyalty over integrity. Across town, the officers had returned to their station. The precinct was an aging building, its once white facade now a dull gray. Inside, the atmosphere was jovial. Nick leaned against his desk, scrolling through the videos they had taken of James. "Look at this one," he said, laughing as he held up his phone. "Man, the look on his face, classic." Jerry chuckled, tossing his empty coffee cup into the trash. "Yeah, I bet he's still out there, probably scared out of his mind." Todd, however, seemed quieter than usual. He sat at his desk, fidgeting with his badge. Something about the encounter didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't quite articulate why. He had joined the force to make a difference, but moments like this made him question whether he was on the right side of the line. "Hey, rookie," Nick called out, snapping Todd from his thoughts. "You're not feeling sorry for him, are you?" Todd shook his head quickly, forcing a laugh. "No, just tired. Long night." Nick smirked, slapping Todd on the back. "That's the spirit. Don't overthink it. We keep this town in check, and that means doing things our way." Back at the lamppost, James shifted slightly as the morning grew warmer. Finally, a young woman approached. She looked to be in her late 20s, dressed in scrubs that suggested she worked at the local clinic. Her dark eyes were filled with both hesitation and concern. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded. "I am now. Could you help me out of this?" She glanced around nervously before pulling a pair of scissors from her bag. As she cut the ropes, James studied her. She moved quickly, but her hands trembled, and she kept glancing over her shoulder. "Thank you," James said as he flexed his wrists, red marks visible where the cuffs had bitten into his skin. "You shouldn't be here," she murmured. "This isn't a safe place for—" Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. "I know," James replied, "but I needed to see it for myself." She looked at him confused. "See what?" James didn't answer directly. Instead, he extended his hand. "James Curtis. And you are?" "Alana," she said reluctantly, shaking his hand. "I work at the clinic down the street. Look, I don't know what happened to you, but you need to be careful. This town, it doesn't change." James gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Sometimes change needs a push." As Alana walked away, James reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone. Despite the officer's arrogance, they hadn't checked him thoroughly. The device had recorded audio of the entire incident. It wasn't just evidence, it was leverage. James knew that his work in Greenville was only beginning. This wasn't just about 3 corrupt officers. It was about dismantling an entire system of oppression and fear. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the first act was already in motion. James left the scene with purpose, his movements calm but deliberate. He knew his next steps had to be carefully calculated. Walking back to his car, parked discreetly several blocks away, he replayed the events in his mind. The evidence he'd gathered, the photos, audio, and his own account, was damning, but he needed more than proof of misconduct. He needed to expose the culture of corruption embedded in Greenville's law enforcement. Sliding into the driver's seat of his SUV, James connected his phone to a secure network. He sent the audio file to a private cloud, then opened a secure messaging app to contact his team. His instructions were concise. Prep the task force. Focus on Greenville. I want everything by morning. James wasn't naive. He knew this operation couldn't just be about legal consequences. It needed to shake the community awake. The officers, their precinct, and even the town's leadership would need to be held accountable in ways that couldn't be swept under the rug. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, the atmosphere began to shift. Todd's unease grew as he overheard Nick and Jerry discussing their plans to share the videos online. The thought of the footage going viral made his stomach churn. It wasn't just the cruelty of the act, it was the recklessness. Todd knew that if the wrong people saw those videos, it could spell trouble, not just for them, but for the entire department. Do we really need to post it? Todd ventured cautiously, trying to sound indifferent. Nick raised an eyebrow. What's the problem, rookie? It's just a bit of fun. Yeah, Jerry added, smirking. No harm done. The guy's probably already out of town by now. Todd forced a laugh, masking his anxiety. He wasn't ready to challenge them directly. Not yet. Instead, he made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. Deep down, he knew this wasn't over. That evening, James set up a base of operations in a rented office space on the outskirts of Greenville. His team, comprised of skilled FBI agents and analysts, arrived within hours. Maps, files, and digital feeds covered the walls, creating a war room dedicated to unraveling Greenville's secrets. Let's start with the basics, James said, addressing the room. I need every complaint, every lawsuit, every piece of buried evidence against this precinct. Find out who's protecting them. Politicians, judges, whoever. No stone unturned. One of his senior agents, a woman named Elena, leaned forward. And the 3 officers? James's jaw tightened. We'll deal with them, but this is bigger than 3 men. I want the entire chain of corruption exposed. As the team got to work, James stepped into a private room and placed a call to Alana, the nurse who had freed him earlier. She answered hesitantly, her voice wary. Mr. Curtis? Just James, he said. I wanted to thank you again for your help. I also wanted to ask if you'd be willing to talk off the record for now. There was a pause. Talk about what? About what it's like living here. About what you've seen. What people are afraid to say out loud. I'm not just here to make arrests, Alana. I'm here to change things. Her silence lingered, but eventually she sighed. All right, but not over the phone. Meet me tomorrow at the clinic early, before anyone else is around. Thank you, James replied. I'll be there. As night fell, Nick, Jerry, and Todd went about their routines, oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Nick, still reveling in his perceived dominance, cracked open a beer at home and scrolled through the videos on his phone. He considered uploading one to his social media, but decided to wait until the morning. Unbeknownst to him, James's team was already monitoring their digital activities. They'd intercepted texts and emails that revealed a deeper web of misconduct, falsified reports, planted evidence, and a pattern of intimidation against Greenville's black residents. In the early hours of the morning, a break came. One of James's analysts discovered a series of encrypted payments made to the precinct's leadership from local business owners. The message was clear: protection money. James stared at the evidence spread before him. It wasn't just about rogue officers. This was systemic. He knew that taking down Nick and his cronies would only be the first step. The next day, James arrived at the clinic before dawn. Alana was waiting for him, her expression guarded. She led him to a small office and closed the door, drawing the blinds. People here are scared, she began. They've been scared for a long time. The police run this town, and anyone who crosses them, well, you've seen what happens. James nodded. I need stories, names, dates, anything you can share. I promise you, Alana, this won't be swept under the rug. She hesitated before handing him a small notebook. I've been keeping track. Patients who came in with injuries they were too scared to report. Families who said the police raided their homes for no reason. It's all in here. James took the notebook, his expression somber. "Thank you. You've done more than you know." As he left the clinic, James felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier on his shoulders. The fight ahead would be brutal, but he was ready. Greenville's time of reckoning had begun. James returned to his makeshift command center, notebook in hand. As he flipped through its pages, the weight of Alana's documentation became evident. Each entry was a window into a life disrupted by unchecked power, a teenager beaten during a routine stop, a single mother evicted under the pretense of a drug raid, an elderly man who died of untreated injuries sustained in custody. The stories were harrowing, and they painted a chilling portrait of a community held hostage by its own protectors. "Alana's notes corroborate everything we've suspected," James told his team, holding the notebook aloft. "But this makes it personal. It's no longer just about exposing corruption. It's about justice for these people." One of his agents, Elena, leaned over the table, frowning. "We've uncovered a network of bribes from local business owners to the precinct's top brass. They're essentially paying for immunity or special favors. The more we dig, the deeper this goes." "The department isn't just complicit, it's profiting," James nodded grimly. "This town isn't just tolerating corruption, it's structured around it. If we're going to take this down, we need to be meticulous. No loose ends." Across town, Nick Holloway was feeling the first ripple of unease. While scrolling through his phone, he noticed an email alerting him to an internal review of his conduct. The timing was suspicious, and though Nick prided himself on his ability to skirt consequences, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. He met Jerry and Todd at a local diner that morning, their usual spot to decompress after a shift. Sliding into the booth, Nick slapped his phone onto the table. "Got a damn email from the brass about a review," he said, his tone irritated. Jerry snorted. "Probably just another routine audit. You've been through those before." "Maybe," Nick replied, lowering his voice. "But something feels off. You ever get the sense that someone's watching?" Todd shifted uncomfortably. The rookie had barely slept the night before, haunted by a gnawing sense of guilt. "We shouldn't have tied that guy up," he blurted. Jerry frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You know what I mean," Todd said, his voice rising slightly. "It wasn't just a joke. We crossed a line." Nick glared at him, his jaw tightening. "Listen, rookie, you signed up for this job, and this is how it works. You don't get to grow a conscience now." Todd held his gaze for a moment before looking away, silently seething but unwilling to push further. Meanwhile, James and his team were finalizing their plan of action. The evidence they had gathered wasn't just damning, it was overwhelming. They decided to focus their initial strike on two fronts: the officers directly involved in James's assault, and the higher-ups who enabled their behavior. "Elena, I want arrest warrants for Nick Holloway, Jerry Wicks, and Todd Carpenter on my desk by morning," James instructed. "Also, notify the U.S. Attorney. This operation is going federal." Elena nodded. "And the precinct's leadership? We move on them simultaneously," James said. "No one gets tipped off. We're bringing the whole house down." As the task force moved into the final stages of preparation, James received an encrypted call from one of his contacts in the Department of Justice. "Curtis," the voice on the other end said, "you're kicking a hornet's nest down there. Are you sure you want to go this big?" "Absolutely," James replied without hesitation. "If we don't, nothing changes." Late that evening, Alana sat in her apartment, scrolling through social media. To her surprise, she found a post from a local activist group sharing an anonymous tip about police misconduct in Greenville. The post hinted at an upcoming investigation that could expose the department's darkest secrets. The thought of her name being linked to the investigation filled her with anxiety, but she knew she had done the right thing. Still, the fear of retaliation lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for the right moment to act. Unbeknownst to her, Todd Carpenter had been parked outside her building for over an hour. The guilt had become unbearable, and though he didn't know why, he felt compelled to apologize. But as he watched her apartment light flicker off, he realized how complicated things had become. At the crack of dawn, Greenville woke to chaos. Federal agents swarmed the precinct, serving arrest warrants and seizing records. Nick Holloway was pulled out of his squad car mid-shift, his face a mix of anger and disbelief as he was cuffed and read his rights. "What the hell is this?" he spat, struggling against the agents. "James Curtis sends his regards," one agent said coldly before shoving Nick into the back of a waiting SUV. Jerry was apprehended at home, still in his pajamas, while Todd, visibly shaken, surrendered without resistance. News of the arrests spread like wildfire. By midday, local and national outlets were reporting the story, framing it as the beginning of a reckoning for Greenville's police force. For the first time, the town's residents began to believe that real change might be possible. The news of the arrests reverberated far beyond Greenville, shaking the foundation of the town's corrupt systems. James watched the live footage from his command center as Nick Holloway was escorted into a federal courthouse, his face a mask of rage and humiliation. Beside him, Jerry Wicks and Todd Carpenter appeared equally disoriented, their usual bravado replaced with fear. Elena stepped into the room holding a file. "It's happening, James. Local officials are scrambling. We've received multiple offers to cooperate. County supervisors, even one of the deputy chiefs. They're panicking." James nodded, his expression focused. "Good. Let them stew. They've been complicit for years, but now they'll have to choose between covering for each other or saving their own necks." At the same time, inside the federal holding cells, Nick Holloway paced like a caged animal. His lawyer, an expensive but morally dubious attorney, had just finished briefing him. "You're looking at serious time, Nick," the lawyer said, adjusting his tie. "But we might have an angle. The higher-ups are the real targets. They want the big fish. If you cooperate—" "Cooperate?" Nick spat, slamming his hands on the metal table. "You think I'm going to sell out my own? That's not how this works." The lawyer leaned back, unimpressed. "How this works is up to you. But let me be clear. If you don't play ball, they'll bury you. The FBI isn't messing around, and Curtis, he's got the clout to make sure you disappear for good." The mention of James's name made Nick's jaw clench. "Curtis," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is all his fault." Back at the clinic, Alana watched the news with a mixture of relief and dread. The arrests were a significant step, but she knew the fight was far from over. Her phone buzzed. A text from James. "Curtis, can you meet later? I need your perspective on the community's next steps." Alana, "Yes, but it'll have to be after my shift. There's still a lot happening here." Curtis, "Understood. Stay safe." Her hands trembled slightly as she put the phone down. She knew her involvement made her a target, but she couldn't turn back now. Meanwhile, James and his team were uncovering the full extent of Greenville's corruption. The evidence pointed to a network of influence that reached far beyond the precinct. Business leaders, city officials, and even state-level politicians had ties to the illegal activities. James stood before a digital map of the town, now dotted with red markers indicating key players in the corruption. "It's bigger than we thought," he said, addressing the team. "This isn't just about Greenville. It's about setting a precedent. If we let this slide, we're sending a message that corruption can thrive unchecked." One of the analysts raised a hand. "Sir, we've intercepted communication between one of the arrested officers and a local developer. They were planning a raid on a community leader who's been vocal against the police." James's eyes narrowed. "When was this supposed to happen?" "Tonight." Without hesitation, James made a decision. "Send a team to protect them. If they move forward with this, we'll catch them red-handed. And alert the media. Let's make sure this doesn't get buried." As evening fell, the tension in Greenville reached a boiling point. James's agents intercepted a group of off-duty officers planning the raid, catching them in the act of planting false evidence. The operation was swift and decisive, with federal agents arriving just in time to stop a potentially deadly confrontation. The arrested officers were led away in front of cameras, their badges stripped from their uniforms. For the first time, Greenville's residents gathered in the streets, watching as justice played out in real time. Among the crowd, Alana stood silently, her heart pounding as she saw James emerge from one of the SUVs. Their eyes met briefly, and she felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in years. Inside the precinct, chaos reigned. The remaining officers were divided, some frantically trying to cover their tracks, others resigning outright. The chief of police, a man who had long benefited from the status quo, sat alone in his office, staring at his resignation letter. The phone on his desk buzzed. Reluctantly, he answered. "This is Chief Davis." "Chief," James's voice came through, calm but firm. I'd suggest you step down before we have to remove you. You've got an hour to make the right choice." The line went dead, leaving Davis to ponder his options. He knew the FBI had more than enough to end his career and likely send him to prison. An hour later, a press release announced Davis's resignation, citing health reasons. James wasn't satisfied, but it was a victory nonetheless. That night, James sat in his office reviewing the day's events. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues and superiors praising the operation's success, but he knew the fight wasn't over. Corruption didn't die with a single raid or a few arrests. It was a disease that required constant vigilance to eradicate. Still, as he looked at the stack of reports, the faces of Greenville's residents came to mind. For them, this was more than a legal battle. It was a chance to reclaim their community. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The reckoning had begun, but the real work was just starting. The following morning, Greenville was awash with a strange mix of tension and anticipation. Headlines across the nation declared, "FBI raids expose decades of corruption in Mississippi Police Department." The arrests of Nick Holloway, Jerry Wicks, Todd Carpenter, and several other officers dominated the news cycle, accompanied by footage of federal agents swarming the precinct and hauling away boxes of evidence. For many residents, the arrests felt like a long overdue reckoning. But others, particularly those who had benefited from the precinct's corruption, were seething. Backdoor meetings were being held across town as local officials and business leaders scrambled to protect themselves. In a dimly lit office in City Hall, Mayor Robert Langford, a man whose political career was deeply entangled with Greenville's police force, sat with his advisors. "This is a disaster," Langford growled, slamming his fist on the desk. "How the hell did this happen under our noses?" One of his advisors, a nervous young aide, hesitated before responding. "With all due respect, sir, it didn't happen under our noses. We allowed it, and now the FBI is exposing everything." Langford's eyes narrowed. "If Curtis thinks he can come into my town and ruin my legacy, he's got another thing coming. Get me everything we have on him. We're not going down without a fight." Across town, James was meeting with community leaders at a local church. The space was packed with residents eager to share their stories and frustrations. Alana stood by the door, observing as James took the stage. "First, let me say this. I'm not here to make promises I can't keep," James began, his voice steady but commanding. "What happened yesterday was just the beginning. I know the fear you've lived with, the injustices you've faced. That stops now, but I need your help. If we're going to rebuild this town, it has to start with you." The room erupted in murmurs. A middle-aged man near the front raised his hand. "And what happens when you leave? We've seen this before. Someone swoops in, makes a big show, and then we're left to pick up the pieces." James nodded. "I understand your skepticism. That's why this isn't just a federal operation. I'm working with the Department of Justice to ensure long-term oversight and accountability. But real change comes from within. You know this town better than anyone. Help us identify the problems and I'll make sure they're addressed." The murmurs grew louder, this time tinged with cautious optimism. Alana finally stepped forward. "He's right," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I've seen what happens when we stay silent. We've let fear control us for too long. It's time we fight back, not with violence but with courage. If we stand together, they can't ignore us." Her words hung in the air, igniting something in the crowd. One by one, residents began to voice their support, sharing their own stories of police harassment and systemic neglect. James listened intently, his resolve strengthening with every testimony. At the same time, Todd Carpenter sat alone in a holding cell, his head in his hands. Unlike Nick and Jerry, Todd wasn't scheming or planning his defense. He was replaying every decision he had made since joining the force, questioning how he had allowed himself to become part of something so toxic. When his lawyer arrived, Todd's first words were, "I'll talk. I'll tell them everything." His confession was a bombshell. Todd not only detailed the events of the previous day, but also provided a roadmap to the precinct's internal corruption, falsified reports, planted evidence, extortion schemes. He named names, implicating not just officers but city officials and local businessmen. By midday, James received a call from Elena. "You're going to want to hear this," she said, patching him into Todd's confession. As James listened, his expression hardened. "This is bigger than we thought," Elena said once the recording ended. Todd just handed us the keys to the kingdom. With his testimony, we can go after everyone involved. James nodded. Good, but make sure we corroborate every detail. This has to be airtight. If even one thread comes loose, they'll use it to unravel the entire case. As night fell, Greenville remained on edge. Supporters of the FBI operation began organizing rallies, while those loyal to the old regime whispered threats and plotted in the shadows. At the same church where James had addressed the community earlier, Alana found him sitting alone in one of the pews, reviewing notes. "Do you ever stop working?" she asked, a faint smile on her lips. James looked up, offering a tired grin. "Not when there's this much at stake." She sat beside him, her voice softening. "You're making a difference, James. People are scared, but they're also hopeful. That's new for us." "That hope has to last," James replied. "And that means we can't let up, not for a second. There are still people out there who want to tear this town apart to save themselves." Alana nodded, her expression somber. "You've started something big. Just make sure you see it through." "I will," James promised. James woke up early the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes and answered, Elena's voice crackled through the line, urgent and tense. "We've got a situation," she said. "Langford's pushing back hard. He's already contacted a state senator, claiming this investigation is a federal overreach. They're accusing us of targeting Greenville unfairly." James sat up, fully alert now. "Let me guess, they're painting themselves as victims to rally public support?" "Exactly," Elena confirmed. "And it's gaining traction. Local news is running stories about outsiders interfering in their town. We're seeing protests forming near City Hall." James exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. This was expected. When corruption loses its grip, it fights back. "Make sure our comms team is ready. I want a public statement emphasizing the evidence we've collected. No conjecture, just facts. And I want it out by noon." By midday, the statement was live. It outlined the systemic corruption uncovered in Greenville, complete with examples backed by hard evidence. The press release also included excerpts from Todd Carpenter's confession and anonymized testimonials from residents, painting a vivid picture of the abuses that had plagued the town for decades. The statement hit its mark. While some in Greenville clung to their defensive narrative, others began questioning their assumptions. Even local businesses, which had long operated in the precinct's shadow, started reconsidering their alliances. James used the brief lull to regroup with his team. Despite the pushback, they were making progress. The arrests and raids had sent shockwaves through the local power structure, and cracks were starting to appear in the walls of silence that had shielded the guilty. "Elena, what's the status on our financial investigation?" James asked during a briefing. "We've traced significant payments from Langford's office to offshore accounts. It's clear he's been skimming from city funds for years, likely to finance his re-election campaigns and personal luxuries," Elena reported. "And the protection racket? The data matches Todd's testimony," she continued. "Several local businesses have been paying security fees directly to the precinct. The money trails lead back to Langford and Chief Davis." James's eyes darkened. "Good. Double-check everything. When we move on Langford, I want the case so solid that even his most loyal allies can't defend him." As night fell, James decided to take a rare moment of reprieve. Alana had invited him to a community dinner at the church. It was an opportunity to connect with the people he was fighting for, but it was also a reminder of what was at stake. The church hall buzzed with life. Families shared meals, children laughed, and elders exchanged stories. The atmosphere was warm, but James could feel the undercurrent of unease. For all the progress being made, the scars of Greenville's history ran deep. Alana approached him, carrying 2 plates of food. "You looked like you could use this," she said, handing him a plate. "Thanks," James replied, offering a small smile. "I don't think I've eaten a proper meal in days." They sat together at one of the long tables, watching the community around them. Alana broke the silence first. "They're starting to believe things can change," she said softly. "But they're scared it won't last. That once you're gone, everything will go back to how it was." James put down his fork, meeting her gaze. "I won't let that happen, Alana. I didn't come here to make a temporary fix. This town deserves better, and I'm going to make sure it gets it." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "You mean that, don't you?" "I do," he said firmly. Across town, the pushback escalated. Langford, cornered and desperate, convened a secret meeting with his remaining allies. Among them were business leaders and state politicians who had benefited from Greenville's corrupt system. "This is a witch hunt," Langford hissed, slamming his fist on the table. "We need to fight back, hard. If Curtis and his people think they can take this town from us, they've got another thing coming." One of the businessmen, a portly man in a tailored suit, frowned. "Fighting back might only make us bigger targets. Maybe we cut our losses and negotiate." Langford glared at him. "Negotiate with Curtis? The man tied my precinct in knots and made me look like a fool. No, we hit him where it hurts. Find out who he is, what he's hiding. Everyone has skeletons. Let's dig." The next morning, James received a chilling message. A photo of his family home in Washington, D.C. with the words, "We're watching you," scrawled across the image. He stared at the photo for a long moment before handing it to Elena. "They're trying to rattle us," he said, his voice calm but cold. Elena's jaw tightened. "Do you want me to pull in additional security?" James shook his head. "No, they want me distracted and I won't give them that satisfaction. But double the detail around my family. I won't take chances with their safety." Later that day, James called a press conference. Standing before a sea of reporters, he addressed both the people of Greenville and the nation. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice firm and resolute. "Justice is not a fleeting act. It is a commitment, a promise to those who have suffered and to those who seek a better future. Greenville is not an isolated case. It is a symptom of a larger problem that we, as a society, must confront. This operation is not about vengeance. It's about accountability, and we will not be intimidated. We will not back down." His words rippled across the room and beyond. For those still clinging to the old regime, it was a warning. For those who had longed for change, it was a beacon of hope. The pressure on James and his team intensified as the investigation closed in on Greenville's most powerful players. While Langford and his allies scrambled to mount their defense, the walls around them were crumbling. Evidence piled up, implicating not only the mayor, but also state-level officials who had turned a blind eye to Greenville's corruption in exchange for political support. James stood at the center of the command room, surrounded by maps, case files, and digital displays. His team worked tirelessly, cross-referencing financial records, phone logs, and testimonies. "Elena," James said, his voice steady but firm, "what's the status on Langford's financials?" "Solid," she replied. "We've traced millions funneled through offshore accounts. It's enough to indict him for money laundering, embezzlement, and racketeering. His connections to the precinct's extortion racket tie it all together." "Good. And the political angle?" "We've identified 2 state senators who've received campaign donations directly from those accounts," Elena said. "They'll be hard to touch, but we've got enough to implicate them publicly. That might force them to cut ties with Langford." James nodded. "Let's move on Langford first. Without him, the rest of the network will start to collapse." The team prepared for the final operation, codenamed Iron Breaker. It was designed to dismantle Greenville's corrupt leadership in one swift, coordinated strike. Arrest warrants were issued for Langford, Chief Davis, and several high-ranking city officials. Agents were briefed on their roles while media liaisons prepared to handle the inevitable public fallout. As James reviewed the plans, Elena approached him with a grim expression. "We intercepted a message from Langford's camp," she said. "They're planning to destroy evidence and possibly retaliate against you personally." James met her gaze, unflinching. "Let them try. We're ready." At City Hall, Langford paced his office, barking orders at his staff. The once confident mayor was now a man unraveling under the weight of his empire's collapse. "Burn everything," he ordered his chief of staff. "Documents, hard drives, anything they can use against us." His staff hesitated. "Sir, if they catch us destroying evidence, they won't," Langford snapped. "Just do it." Unbeknownst to him, James's team had already secured surveillance on City Hall. Agents watched as Langford's staff began shredding documents and smashing hard drives, capturing every move on video. The next morning, Greenville woke to chaos. Federal agents stormed City Hall, the precinct, and several private residences simultaneously. Langford was pulled from his office in handcuffs, shouting protests to the reporters gathered outside. "This is political persecution," he yelled as flashbulbs lit up his face. "Curtis is trying to destroy this town. James watched the live coverage from the command center, his expression unreadable. Elena approached, a satisfied smile on her face. "We got him," she said. James nodded. Now the real work begins. Despite the arrests, resistance lingered in the shadows. Groups loyal to Langford and the old regime began organizing protests, fueled by misinformation campaigns that painted James and the FBI as invaders bent on destroying Greenville's way of life. At one such protest, tensions boiled over into violence. A small group of agitators threw rocks at federal agents and vandalized property, leading to several arrests. The incident dominated the news cycle, giving Langford's allies an opportunity to push their narrative of victimhood. James addressed the situation directly in a televised statement. Standing before a backdrop of the American flag, he spoke with unwavering conviction. "I understand the fear and uncertainty many in Greenville are feeling," he began. "Change is never easy, especially when it disrupts systems that have been in place for generations. But let me be clear, this investigation is not about tearing this town apart. It's about rebuilding it on a foundation of fairness and accountability. To those who choose violence or intimidation, know this: you will be held accountable. To those who seek justice, we stand with you. Together, we can create a Greenville where everyone is truly equal under the law." His words resonated with many, but the division in Greenville was palpable. That evening, James met Alana at the clinic. She looked exhausted, the weight of the town's turmoil evident in her posture. "They're scared," she said, referring to her patients. "Even the ones who hated the old system don't know what comes next. They've lived with corruption for so long, they don't know how to trust anyone anymore." James leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "That's why we have to follow through. If we stop now, we prove them right. They'll think this was just another headline-grabbing operation that leaves them worse off." Alana studied him for a moment. "Do you ever doubt yourself?" James hesitated. "Sometimes. But then I remember why I'm doing this. It's not about me. It's about them. About you. About making sure this place has a future worth fighting for." Her eyes softened, and for the first time she allowed herself to hope. As the night deepened, James returned to his command center. He reviewed the final pieces of the operation, ensuring no detail had been overlooked. The arrests were just the beginning. The trials would be long and grueling, and the road to rebuilding Greenville would be fraught with challenges. But James was ready. He had faced darker days, and he knew that true justice required persistence and courage. The stage was set for the climax, and the battle for Greenville's soul was far from over. The day of reckoning for Greenville arrived under a gray, overcast sky. In a federal courtroom packed with reporters, attorneys, and community members, the defendants, including Langford, Chief Davis, Nick Holloway, and other key figures, stood before a judge as prosecutors laid out the case against them. James sat in the gallery, his expression calm but watchful. Months of investigation, countless hours of planning, and the courage of Greenville's residents had culminated in this moment. The weight of it was palpable. The prosecutor, a sharp and confident woman named Marissa Quinn, presented the evidence with surgical precision. She outlined the extortion schemes, the protection rackets, and the financial embezzlement that had propped up Greenville's corrupt power structure for years. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, addressing the court, "this case is about more than just these defendants. It's about a system of unchecked power and abuse. It's about the victims, those who suffered in silence for decades while these individuals enriched themselves and preyed on their community. Today, we seek not only justice for those victims, but a message to every corrupt institution. Your time is up." Outside the courthouse, a different battle was raging. Protesters had gathered, their ranks divided between those demanding accountability and others loyal to Langford, who continued to frame himself as a victim of political persecution. The crowd's energy was volatile. Chants and counterchants echoed through the streets, and the tension felt like a lit fuse. Alana stood among the supporters of the FBI's efforts, holding a sign that read, "Justice for Greenville." She recognized many faces, patients, neighbors, even former classmates, but the mood was heavy. The opposition was loud, emboldened by Langford's propaganda. As the protests swelled, rumors of agitators planted to incite violence spread through the crowd. Alana's stomach churned. She knew that one wrong move could derail everything James and his team had worked for. Inside the courtroom, the defense attempted to counter the overwhelming evidence. Langford's lawyer, a silver-tongued strategist, leaned heavily on emotional appeals. "My client is a dedicated public servant," he argued, pacing before the jury. "Yes, mistakes were made, but this investigation has been a witch hunt from the start. A politically motivated attack on a small-town leader doing his best under difficult circumstances." Langford sat at the defense table, his face carefully composed, but James could see the cracks in his facade. This wasn't the confident, defiant man who had been dragged from his office weeks ago. This was a man desperate to hold on to what little power he had left. As the trial continued, a commotion erupted outside. James's phone buzzed, and Elena's voice came through the earpiece. "We've got a situation," she said. "The protest outside is escalating. Someone just threw a bottle at the agents monitoring the crowd." James rose from his seat and slipped out of the courtroom, heading for the command post stationed near the courthouse. "What's the status?" he asked as he entered the room. Elena pointed to a live feed from the protest. The scene was chaotic, shouting, pushing, and signs waving frantically. On one side, Langford's supporters were growing increasingly aggressive, while the other side tried to maintain order. "Agitators in the crowd are stoking the fire," Elena explained. "We've identified a few known instigators, likely hired by Langford's people to discredit the investigation." James's jaw tightened. "Get local leaders to de-escalate. No force unless absolutely necessary. We can't afford for this to turn into a headline about FBI overreach." Back at the protest, Alana found herself caught in the fray. As tensions boiled over, someone shoved her from behind, and she stumbled into a group of Langford's supporters. "Look who it is," one man sneered. "The clinic nurse who thinks she's better than everyone else." Alana didn't back down. "I'm here because this town deserves better. What about you? Are you really okay with what Langford and his cronies did to us?" Her words struck a chord with some, but others weren't interested in reason. One man stepped closer, his face contorted with anger. "You think you're safe because the FBI's here? You're nothing without them." Before the situation could escalate further, federal agents moved in, positioning themselves between Alana and the agitators. The sight of their presence calmed some, but the tension lingered. Inside the courtroom, the trial reached its peak. Marissa Quinn delivered her closing argument with unflinching resolve. "This case isn't about politics. It's about accountability," she said, her voice steady. "The evidence speaks for itself. These men abused their power, betrayed the public trust, and caused untold harm to the people of Greenville. Today you have the chance to send a message that no one is above the law." The defense attorney made his final plea, but the cracks in their case were undeniable. Hours later, the jury returned with their verdict. James sat in the gallery, his heart pounding as the judge read the findings. Guilty on all counts. Langford's face fell, his carefully constructed facade crumbling at last. Nick Holloway and the other officers showed no emotion, their arrogance replaced by quiet resignation. The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps, but James remained still, a quiet sense of satisfaction washing over him. Justice had prevailed. Outside, the announcement of the verdict reached the crowd. For a moment, the noise subsided, replaced by a collective intake of breath. Then, cheers erupted from one side while the other dispersed, defeated. Alana found herself in tears, the weight of the moment overwhelming. She looked up to see James stepping out of the courthouse. Their eyes met, and she nodded, a silent thank you. James approached her, his voice calm but resolute. "This is just the beginning," he said. "I know," Alana replied, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "But it's a damn good start." The days following the verdict marked the beginning of a profound transformation in Greenville. The guilty parties, Langford, Nick Holloway, Chief Davis, and their co-conspirators, were transported to federal penitentiaries, their sentences ranging from decades to life behind bars. The community was left grappling with the aftermath. For many, the trial had validated their suffering, but it also stirred long-buried wounds. The stories of victims, once whispered in fear, were now shared openly in town meetings, church gatherings, and community forums. James Curtis stood at the forefront of this transition. His presence in Greenville became a symbol of accountability, but he was careful to shift the focus back to the people. He knew the town's healing couldn't come from outside forces alone. It had to be driven by its residents. At a town hall meeting, James addressed a packed room. "Greenville's story isn't over," he said. "The arrests and convictions were necessary, but they're not the end. Real change takes time, and it starts here, with you. I'll be working with federal and state agencies to ensure this town gets the resources it needs to rebuild. But the culture of this community, the trust, the unity, that's up to you." Local elections were scheduled to replace the corrupt officials who had been removed from office. For the first time in years, residents felt empowered to vote, knowing their voices would no longer be overshadowed by bribery and intimidation. Alana played a pivotal role in the rebuilding process. Her work at the clinic became more than just medical care. It was a space where people came to share their concerns and find support. With James's encouragement, she joined a committee tasked with overseeing police reform in Greenville, ensuring the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. One evening, as the two sat on the steps of the church after another long community meeting, Alana turned to James. "Do you think it'll last?" she asked, her tone tinged with both hope and doubt. James looked out at the quiet street, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows. "It has to," he said. "If it doesn't, then everything we've done here means nothing. But I believe in these people. They've been through hell and they're still standing. That's resilience." She nodded, a small smile forming. "And what about you? Where do you go from here?" James exhaled, leaning back on his hands. "There's always another Greenville somewhere, another town, another system to fix. But this one will always mean something to me." As James prepared to leave Greenville, his mission complete, the town stood on the cusp of a new era. The scars of the past remained, but they served as reminders of what had been overcome. The people had reclaimed their voice, their power, and their hope. James drove out of town at dawn, the rising sun painting the horizon in hues of gold and red. He carried with him not just the satisfaction of a job well done, but the knowledge that Greenville's story wasn't just about justice. It was about rebirth. Years later, a plaque was unveiled in the town square of Greenville. It bore the names of the residents who had fought for justice and a simple inscription: "In honor of those who refused to stay silent. Justice is not given, it is earned." Among the attendees at the unveiling were Alana, now a community leader, and James, whose unexpected return brought cheers and gratitude. As they stood together, watching the crowd, Alana turned to James. "You were right," she said. "Change starts here, and it keeps going," James replied. Greenville's story reminds us that justice is never easy. It's a battle fought by those brave enough to challenge the status quo. Share this story with others. Start conversations in your own communities. Ask questions, demand accountability, and above all, refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Together we can create a world where justice and equality are not just ideals, but realities.